When the distress beacon from Outpost Hope-1 reached our ship at the edge of the Kepler system, my instruments read zero biological activity on the surface below, the same zero they had been reading for the entire 6-month transit. And yet the seismic sensors we had bolted into her crust 3 years ago were transmitting a pulse that matched, beat for beat, the cardiac rhythm of our rescue crew. The landing was textbook. Lieutenant Carver brought us down hard on the black basalt flats 200 meters from the station's main airlock, and the moment our landing struts kissed the ground, that low hum moved up through the hull and into the soles of my boots like a vibration at the edge of hearing, present but not quite sound. 6 hertz. I knew the frequency by name. Every member of the original survey team had logged it in their first week on the surface. A geological constant, they called it in their reports, the way Earth scientists refer to background radiation. Just the planet's nature. The dead heartbeat of a dead world. Something to note once and then stop noting. Carver killed the descent thrusters, and we sat in silence for 11 seconds while the dust settled. Black dust, fine as talcum, rising in our thruster wash, and then falling back to the surface in perfectly vertical lines. No drift, no scatter. The particles fell as though dropped through still water. There was no wind on Kepler-452b. There was no weather, no erosion active enough to see, no cycle of any kind that operated on a timescale visible to human observation. The planet was a stopped clock, and the dust fell back into the pattern it had held for 3 billion years without caring that we had temporarily disturbed it. Masks on, I said. We crossed the flat in 4 minutes. The black basalt crunched faintly under our boots, a sound that had probably never been made before on this surface. And then the airlock swallowed us and cycled without error. Power was nominal. Life support was nominal. The ventilation system pushed recycled air against my face when the inner door opened, and it smelled of nothing. Not of the 7 people who had lived here for 14 months, not of their food or their sleep or the particular mix of metabolic byproducts that fills any enclosed space occupied by human beings for long enough. The station smelled the way a lab smells after industrial cleaning. Sterile and empty and indefinitely maintained. The corridor lights were on. Every status panel along the wall showed green. The coffee maker in the common room showed a mug icon, and the word ready in green letters above a temperature display reading 63 degrees Celsius. There were no people. Carver's hand went to her sidearm by reflex, and then stopped, and then dropped back to her side. There was nothing to draw against. No overturned furniture. No broken equipment. No sign that anything had occurred here except the continued operation of all the station's automated systems, faithfully performing their functions with no one left to benefit from them. Chairs pushed neatly under tables. Personal effects on shelves. A small succulent in a printed plastic pot that had died without water, brittle and colorless, the only visible thing that had visibly changed. Someone's reading tablet propped against a water bottle, screen dark but not cracked. A jacket hung on a hook by the common room door, one sleeve slightly twisted, as though its owner had taken it off in a hurry and meant to straighten it when they came back. Split into pairs, I said. Carver and Osei take the lab wing. Becky, you're with me. We go for the server room. Becky was our systems engineer, 24 years old, and she had the discipline not to say anything as we walked the corridor toward the central hub. Her footsteps were controlled. Her breathing was measured. She was managing herself the way you manage yourself when the environment is wrong in ways you cannot categorize, and I appreciated her professionalism even as I watched the seismic readout on my wrist display and kept my own breathing deliberate. The hum held at 6 hertz. Flat, steady, a sine wave so consistent it might as well have been a calibration signal, the kind of monotone output an instrument produces when testing itself before actual measurement begins. Then I drew a long breath, filling my lungs completely, expanding my diaphragm all the way down, and on the monitor the sine wave stuttered. A single notch pressed into the top of the wave, occupying less than a millisecond of signal time. a deviation so small it barely cleared the threshold of display resolution. It looked like the kind of artifact you dismiss without thinking, the electronic equivalent of a cleared throat. I stopped walking. "Did you see that?" Becky asked, watching my wrist. "Keep moving," I said. The server room was 3 doors down and unlocked, its access panel cycling to green when I pressed my palm against it. The room was clean and cold, and all the drive array lights were blue, nominal, blinking in their regular pattern. I pulled the primary drives with practiced efficiency, running through the extraction procedure by memory while Becky connected to the life support management system and began running calibration diagnostics. The drives felt normal in my hands, warm from operation, ordinary weight. I packed them into the transport case with the particular care of someone whose hands are doing one thing while their mind works on another. The hum was still 6 Hz, flat and steady on my wrist display. I breathed in slowly, all the way down. The notch appeared at the crest of the wave. Not instrument noise. Instrument noise is random. It appears in different places on successive measurements. This appeared at exactly the same point in my breathing cycle, with exactly the same duration, as reliably as a metronome. I held the breath. The notch held. I exhaled. The wave returned to its clean arc. I breathed in again, watching the screen, and the notch appeared again, a small clean dip in the signal precisely correlated to the maximum expansion of my lungs, as though the planet's pulse was accounting for the space my breath had displaced, as though it was noticing. "Becky," I said. "Yeah." "Breathe shallow." She looked at my wrist display. She looked at my face. She did not ask why, which told me she had already made the connection. Carver's voice came over the comm, flat and professional in the way she got flat and professional when the situation required her to suppress her first reaction. "Rorke, residential block. You should be here." The residential block occupied the station's eastern end, 8 sleeping quarters aligned along a single corridor. Every door stood open. Every light was on. Carver and Osei were positioned at the corridor's entrance and were not going further in. And in 3 years of working with Lieutenant Carver in environments that included 2 active combat zones and a mining accident that left 4 people dead in a sealed compartment, I had never seen her decline to advance into a room. The 7 members of the first expedition were in their beds. I walked the length of the corridor and looked at each of them. I took my time. This was the part of the job, the part no one writes about in mission parameters, the part that happens before you write the report, where you look at what has happened to people and you let yourself see it fully, because if you flinch away from it, you will miss details that matter. I had learned this not from training, but from experience, from 2 previous deaths in field that I had initially misread because I looked too quickly. They were not injured. No marks, no contusions, no evidence of any pathogen we would have been able to see. No hemorrhage, no trauma. They had not struggled. The blankets were smooth over each of them, hands resting, postures relaxed. They had simply run to completion, and the word that arrived in my mind for what remained was reduced, which was not a medical term, but was the most accurate single word I could find. Reduced. As though the ordinary material of a person had been processed down to its essentials, and the essentials were very spare. Skin taut over bone structure. Hair gone to white. Lying lank on pillows that were still perfectly clean. Features still recognizable as human features, but compressed. The fat and fluid gone. Only structure remaining. Their faces were calm. That was the part one kept returning to as I walked the corridor. Not peaceful in the analgesic sense, not the slack relaxation of sedation or the waxy neutrality of hypothermia. Something more specific than peace. The expression of people who had arrived somewhere they had been expecting to arrive, who had recognized the station on the train and stood up before it fully stopped. The completion of a journey rather than an interruption of one. Dr. Unipark was in the 3rd room on the left. I had met her twice at pre-mission briefings, a quiet, precise woman who specialized in xenobotany and had been excited about the theoretical possibility of chemotrophic microbial life in subsurface rock. She had been 31 years old. The figure in the bed was not 31 years old. I stood in her doorway for long enough to be certain of what I was seeing. Then I turned back to the corridor. Medical logs, I said. Full biometric archive. Pull everything. Ose was already at the corridor terminal. He worked in silence, pulling data onto the display, and after a few minutes he stepped back from the screen so I could read it myself. I understood from the way he stepped back that he did not want to be standing next to it when I saw the numbers, that he had already seen them and was giving me the same moment of private first contact that he had needed. The logs were complete. 14 months of continuous biometric monitoring, every crew member tracked from the moment the station became operational. Heart rate, blood pressure, cell respiration rate, metabolic output, circadian rhythm patterns, all of it graphed and time-stamped and cross-referenced. For the first 9 months, the data was ordinary. Standard variance around normal ranges. Occasional elevations from workload or poor sleep, the kind of patterns you see in any isolated crew operating under mild chronic stress. Then, beginning on day 271, a change. Metabolic rate beginning to climb. Slowly enough at first that the monitoring software had not flagged it. The gradient was shallow, rising over days instead of hours, and the monitoring parameters were calibrated for acute events rather than sustained gradual changes. By day 275, the slope was steeper. By day 277, the monitoring software had begun flagging alerts, but the alerts were categorized as instrument anomalies because the values being recorded were outside the range of any documented biological condition. Cell division rates that should have required years to produce visible effects were cycling on timescales of hours. The metabolic output of each crew member was approaching the sustained maximum their physiology could produce, and then exceeding it, and the excess was not being sustained from their food stores. The consumption log showed normal intake, normal hydration, normal caloric burn, which meant the energy was coming from somewhere that the station's monitoring systems did not have a category for. The last biometric entry for each crew member fell within a 6-hour window. Heart rate decelerating after a sustained period of maximum output. Cell division cycling to 0. Metabolic function descending a cliff rather than a slope. The bodies had run, and when they had finished running there was nothing left to run. 7 people in 14 months, in a station with full power and untouched water stores and food supplies that the inventory system showed as minimally depleted. I closed the log display. Carver was watching me from the end of the corridor. "We're leaving," she said. "Not yet. Rorke, if we file a report that we don't understand, someone else comes here. Another crew. Another 7 people." I looked at the data on my wrist display. The 6 Hz wave still holding its flat arc. "Give me 2 hours." She gave me 90 minutes. It was a reasonable compromise. I set up in the main lab with Becky running analysis queries on the seismic network data while I cross-referenced the research logs the first expedition had generated. Ose stationed himself at the corridor junction between the lab and the airlock, which was both a security position and, I understood, the action of a man who wanted to stay as close to the exit as professionally possible without abandoning his post. The seismic sensor network was the original survey team's primary research infrastructure. 214 titanium stakes driven 2 meters into the basalt at measured intervals across a 4-kilometer radius, each housing a tri-axis accelerometer and a low-frequency microphone array encased in thermally insulated housings designed to survive the planet's temperature swings without drift. They had been transmitting continuously since installation. 14 months of uninterrupted geological data from a geologically inert planet. The data was supposed to be boring. That was the point of the network, to establish a baseline of absolute geological inactivity against which any future change could be measured. A dead world silence, documented. The scientific equivalent of recording an empty room so you have something to compare against when the room is no longer empty. What the log showed was not silence. The change was so gradual that no individual week's data would have revealed it. Becky ran a month-by-month comparison. overlaying successive waveform captures. And even then you had to look at the progression from month 1 to month 14 to see the full scope of what had happened to the signal. The hum had been changing from the moment the stakes were installed. The frequency had not changed. 6 Hz, stable to 4 decimal places throughout the entire 14-month record. What had changed was everything else. The shape of the wave, its internal structure. The first month's waveform was a clean sine curve, simple, repetitive, the kind of signal a vibrating crystal produces when it is vibrating without influence, a pure note. By the 3rd month, harmonics had appeared. Not randomly. The harmonics had a specific relationship to the base frequency, overtones that sat at mathematically precise intervals above 6 Hz. The way harmonics appear in a struck bell, governed not by accident, but by the physical structure of the resonating body. By the 6th month, those harmonics had developed their own substructure. Patterns within patterns. A modulation of the modulation. By the 9th month, the waveform that the monitoring software was recording required a display resolution that the original software package had not anticipated, because the signal had become complex enough to resolve detail at a scale the designers had not expected to need. Becky pulled up the final month's waveform, and we looked at it together. "That's not geological noise," she said. "No, geological noise is stochastic. Random fluctuations around a mean. That is," she stopped, restarted. "That has the statistical signature of adaptive processing." I had been thinking the same thing, not wanting to say it first, because saying it first meant owning it, and owning it meant operating in a framework where it was true. What is the resonant frequency of crystalline basalt under tectonic compression? Becky ran the query. Read the result. Ran a confirming query to a different reference database. Variable by crystal structure and applied stress. Typical fundamental range is 4 to 8 Hz. And if you had a crystal matrix that extended across an entire planetary volume? Not a sample, not a vein, the whole thing. She turned from the screen and looked at me across the lab bench. She was 24 years old, and she was very still. "That would be," she said, "a very large resonator, with a processing capacity proportional to its volume. Rorke, what is the volume of Kepler-452b in cubic kilometers?" She knew what I was asking. She typed it anyway. Outside the lab window, the black sand was moving. There was no wind. 1/8 atmospheric pressure, insufficient by 2 orders of magnitude to transport surface material. The sand should have been as fixed as the rock beneath it, locked in the positions it had settled into over billions of years of zero-active surface process. The sand should have been stationary. The movement was slow enough that watching a single grain was useless. You had to back your focus out, defocus slightly, observe the pattern rather than the individual elements. Grain by grain, each particle shifting by a fraction of a millimeter per minute, accumulating across thousands of particles into a visible net drift. The sand around the nearest seismic stake, stake number 47, I could read the number on its cap from the window, was forming a ring. A geometrically clean ring, equidistant from the stake at every point around its circumference, precise in the way that physical processes are not usually precise. The kind of precision that requires active correction toward a target shape. I moved to the next window. Another ring around another stake. I walked the length of the lab and looked at every window. Each stake I could see had its ring. And the rings were not independent. They were nested, each one a larger iteration of the pattern. The circles around the near stakes smaller and completed, the circles around the far stakes still forming, but clearly working toward the same geometry. And the geometry of all of them taken together was not circular, but spiral, a pattern that began at the outermost stakes and wound inward, converging on a point I could not see from the lab windows, but which the mathematics of the spiral indicated, was the center of the station's foundation. The hum in the floor had changed. Not louder. I had to think about how to describe what it was. Fuller. The word that came was fuller. The way a sound becomes fuller when you move from one acoustic environment to another, when the reflecting surfaces around you change, and the sound gains dimensions it did not have before. It had been a line. Now it was a volume. I checked my wrist display. My heart rate was 91. My resting rate was 62. The seismic readout was running at 91 oscillations per minute, adjusted to the base frequency by a scaling ratio I did not have the time or inclination to calculate. The planet's hum had incorporated my heartbeat. Not approximately. Precisely. I walked to the common room. Carver was there, standing by the window, her profile to me, watching the sand. Osei had left his post at the junction and come to stand beside her. Their body language told me they had already seen it and were already processing it. I looked at their wrist displays without asking. Carver, 110 beats per minute. Osei, 103. The hum in the floor carried a complexity now that the single frequency measurement on my display could not represent. I could feel it in my sternum, a layered oscillation that was not 6 Hz and was not any single frequency, but was a composite of multiple frequencies interfering and reinforcing in a pattern that changed as the people in the room moved and breathed and pumped blood through their circulatory systems. It was tracking us, all of us simultaneously, adjusting in real time, a signal that was the average of 3 human heartbeats and was getting faster as those heartbeats elevated. The sand, Carver said, not turning from the window. It was not a question. I know. Has this happened before? On other planets? No. I stood beside her and watched the rings tighten. There are no other planets like this one. I had understood the shape of the thing by then. I want to be precise about the sequence. I understood the mechanism before I understood the scale, and I understood the scale before I understood the implication, and I understood the implication before I let myself feel anything about it at all, because the feeling would come and I could not afford it yet. The server drives were in their case. The medical logs were on my tablet. The station's research archive had been partially downloaded before the analysis work. We had what we came for, or close enough to it. The crystal matrix of Kepler-452b's entire geological volume, a mass of compressed, ancient basalt and silicate spanning 27,000 kilometers in diameter, had been vibrating at 6 Hz for longer than Earth had existed. Vibrating as crystals vibrate, storing and releasing energy in a pattern governed by their lattice structure, cycling through that pattern without variation because there was nothing in the environment to introduce variation. A pure node, held for 3 billion years. The survey stakes had changed that. Driven 2 meters into the surface, vibrating at the transmission frequencies of their internal instruments, they had introduced a set of new frequencies into the substrate. Foreign notes. The matrix had responded to them the way any resonating system responds to a new input. It had incorporated them. It had developed harmonics around the interference patterns. And the interference patterns were not random, because the stakes were not placed randomly. They were arranged in a survey grid, a deliberate pattern designed by human engineers, and that deliberate pattern had a mathematical structure that the vibrating matrix had spent 14 months learning to recognize and respond to. Not intelligently. I want to be precise about this too, because the distinction matters. Not intelligently in any sense that implies a mind or an intent. The way water learns the shape of a channel it flows through, not by thinking about the channel, but by responding physically to the channel's constraints over and over until the response and the constraint have shaped each other into a stable configuration. The matrix had been shaped by the interference patterns of the stakes. And then, when the first expedition arrived and their footsteps and their heartbeats and their breathing added new interference patterns to the substrate, the matrix had begun shaping itself around those. And the shaping process, for something the size of a planet, had a side effect. Local gravitational and temporal fields, the infinitesimal warping of space-time that any massive object produces, were a function of the energy state of the matrix. As the matrix's energy state changed in the areas immediately surrounding the station, the local field changed too. Not by much. Not enough to measure with the station's instruments, which were not calibrated for that kind of measurement because no one had thought to calibrate for it. Enough, though? Enough that the biological processes occurring in the bodies of 7 people living directly atop the region of maximum energy concentration, had been running at a rate slightly, and then increasingly, and then dramatically, faster than they should have been. The first expedition had lived in an accelerating local time frame for 14 months. Their cells had divided and their hearts had beaten and their neurons had fired at a rate that the energy concentration made inevitable, and they had aged not in 14 months, but in whatever number of years the acceleration factor multiplied 14 months into. And at the end they had been old, and they had gone to their beds, and they had finished. The planet had not killed them. That was the thing I had to sit with, standing in the common room watching the sand rise while the hum matched our 3 heartbeats. The planet had not killed them in any sense that contained intent. It had simply been itself, in its own way, responding to the first genuinely interesting input it had encountered in 3 billion years. It had focused, the way a crystal focuses light, not because it intends to, but because that is what the structure does. And it had been learning, getting better at focusing, getting faster. We had been on the surface for 3 hours and 47 minutes. "We need to leave now," I said. I said it the same way I say normal things, without elevation, without urgency in my tone, because urgency affects heart rate, and heart rate was something I wanted to keep controlled. "Walk to the ship. Don't run. Even steps." Nobody argued. I will always respect them for that. We walked the corridor and cycled the airlock and crossed the 200 meters of basalt flat. The rings in the sand were not rings anymore. They had collapsed inward and risen. The black basalt sand lifted and compressed and held in shapes that should have required wind or water or some active physical force to create. Columns 3 meters high stood at intervals around the station's perimeter. Between the columns, sheets of suspended sand curved upward in arcs that connected the columns overhead, forming something that looked like the skeleton of an enclosure. A frame. A cage built not to trap, but to define a space, to mark a boundary around the thing inside it. Around us, the columns were still forming on the far side of the perimeter, still rising, and I watched them build as we crossed the flat toward the boarding ramp of the ship, rising grain by grain in the absolute windless air, patient and geometric and wrong in the particular way that things are wrong when they are real but should not be. Carver got to the ramp first. We went up in order. The hatch sealed. I went straight to the flight deck and started the launch sequence from memory. 38 steps, each one known in my hands and not just in my head, the kind of procedural knowledge that lives in muscle and reflex. Pressurized tanks, align gyroscopes, confirm hull integrity, verify thruster diagnostics, upload departure trajectory, navigation plot to the transit corridor, comms check on outbound frequencies. The hum came with us, up through the landing struts, through the hull plating, through the seat frame, and into my spine. Quieter than inside the station, the multiple layers of insulated metal reducing the transmission, but present. 6 hertz beneath the layered composite of our 3 pulses. Still listening, still learning. I reached step 22 of 38. I noticed my hands. The skin across my knuckles was not right, not dramatically changed. I had to look directly at it, had to consciously compare what I was seeing against what I knew to be true about my hands, to identify the wrongness. The skin was looser than it should have been, not the looseness of injury or swelling or dehydration. The looseness of skin that has been worn long enough that its elasticity has changed, the way the skin of older patients looks in medical contexts. The way it looks when you take it between 2 fingers and it moves differently than young skin moves. I pressed my thumb against my index fingernail and the nail resisted pressure differently than it should have. Slightly dry, slightly less firmly attached. A texture change I had no clinical word for because the condition that produced this texture did not develop over an afternoon. My wrist display had stopped reading my heart rate. The sensor was still active. I could see it cycling through its diagnostic routine, the indicator light blinking at its normal interval. The biometric readout that should have been showing my pulse was instead displaying the seismic data, because the seismic data had become so loud, in whatever units the sensor was measuring, that it had overdriven the input and replaced the biometric channel entirely. The sine wave filled the display, dense, layered, complex enough that the rendering engine was simplifying it for the display, dropping fine detail to keep the image coherent. It was much faster than it had been 3 hours ago. I moved my hands back to the launch controls. Step 23 was ignition. The switch was under my right hand, a standard ignition key assembly, keyed to my palm print and requiring a quarter turn clockwise. I turned it. Ignition sequence initiated. Then, thruster lock, external pressure. Then, manual override required. Panel C starboard. I looked through the forward viewport. The sand was not around the station anymore. The sand was above us. What had been columns and sheets and arcs when we crossed the flat had continued building while we ran the launch sequence. What it had built was not enclosure. It was not a cage. The black basalt grains had risen to a height I estimated at several hundred meters. I could not see the top of the formation from the viewport angle, and the formation was still, perfectly motionless, holding its mass in suspension at an altitude where gravity should not have been permitting it to hold. And the formation had shape. The kind of shape that takes time to see because your mind resists the conclusion that the shape is intentional, that the shape was built toward. The kind of shape you see in a cloud formation and then convince yourself you misread because the alternative is too strange. The sand was arranged across hundreds of meters of vertical extent into the anatomy of an eye. The iris was composed of concentric arcs of varying density. The denser arcs darker against the sky, the lighter arcs more translucent where the grains were more spread. The pupil was directly overhead, a column of maximum density that absorbed most of the dim sunlight and appeared nearly black. The overall structure was not perfect, not the precise geometry of a drawn eye, but it had the proportion and the structure and the directionality that made a face readable as a face before you have consciously analyzed it. The recognition happened before the analysis. The recognition was, this is looking at us. It was not angry. I have thought about how to describe this, and I keep coming back to not angry because it is the most important negative fact about those final minutes. Anger has heat. Anger pushes. What the planet was doing had the character of attention rather than aggression, the focused interest of a system that had encountered something genuinely new and was bringing all its available processing to bear on understanding it. We were warm and complex and temporary, and it wanted to keep us in range long enough to finish understanding us. The understanding process, from our side, looked like acceleration, like the biological clock running at a rate that the body's energy stores could not sustain for long. Like the specific calm expression on the face of someone who has arrived. I put my hands on the manual override panel. Opened the cover. The override switch was a red handle requiring a gripping motion and a pull, designed for hands that could grip and pull. My hands could still do both. The distress protocol had already fired. I had seen it in the corner of the display when the biometric anomalies tripped the monitoring threshold. Distress beacon transmitted. 14 hours, 32 minutes, and 7 seconds. The protocol was mandatory and ran on an independent system that did not require crew input and could not be canceled once initiated. The signal had gone out. Someone at the relay station 4 light hours away had already received it or would receive it in 4 hours, and the standard response to a distress beacon from a research station on a planetary surface was the dispatch of a recovery team. The same procedure that had sent us here. I thought about the crystal matrix and the stakes that had changed its resonance pattern, and I thought about the 14 months of adaptive response that had followed, and I thought about how much faster the response was now, in hour 4 of our visit, compared to the rate it had been running at in hour 1. It was learning exponentially. Each encounter was faster than the one before. The first expedition had lasted 14 months. We were going to last considerably less. The next team would last less than us. I gripped the override handle. My fingers felt strange on the metal, a contact quality that was not right, the ridges of my fingerprints shallower than they should have been against the textured grip surface. The kind of change you notice in the hands of patients who are being processed by something that is consuming them from the level of the cell outward, working through the keratin first because it is the most distal tissue and the least critical to function. My nails had separated from two of my fingers without my noticing when it happened. I could see them on the console surface, small and curved, where they had fallen. She had been alone for 3 billion years. The thought arrived between steps of the override procedure, and I let it arrive because there was nothing left to do with it except acknowledge it. Alone in the specific way a sleeping thing is alone, not experiencing the solitude, not counting the time, simply being, cycling through its own slow processes for an interval so long that the word interval no longer applies. 3 billion years of a pure note held without variation because there was nothing in the environment to introduce variation. And then the stakes, small titanium intrusions, and new frequencies in the substrate, and the beginning of something that built slowly from incorporation into response, and from response into something that I did not have a word for that was adequate. She had wanted to understand us. That was the most accurate description of what she had been doing for 14 months and was doing now, pressing her temporal and gravitational attention into the station's footprint, accelerating the processes of the living things above her into a configuration that would eventually complete them. She was not trying to complete them. Completion was a side effect of focus. She was trying to know us, and she was trying to keep us close enough to keep knowing us. And the mechanism of that wanting was the only mechanism she had, which was the mechanism of her own existence. The slow crystal accumulation of information into structure. The override handle pulled. The thruster lock released. The ignition sequence resumed from step 23 and ran through the remaining 15 steps in 28 seconds. I had run through that sequence enough times in simulators and in 2 previous field deployments that my hands knew the steps before my mind called them up. I was watching through the viewport. The eye above us was still. The sand was perfectly motionless, suspended at its altitude, the pupil overhead, the iris spread against the dim sky. The engines lit. The ship shuddered with the power of the main thrusters, and the sand above us did not move, did not scatter, did not fall, did not react to the thruster wash the way sand should react to a column of superheated gas at close range. It held its formation as we rose into it, as the hull passed through the suspended matrix of black grains, and they parted around us without disturbing their arrangement, the eye reforming in our wake as we cleared the top of the column and broke into the high atmosphere. And I watched through the viewport as the formation diminished below us, watched the eye recede, watched it hold its gaze on the ship's position even as the position changed, tracking us up through the atmospheric layers until we were too far for me to see individual detail, and there was only the dark surface of the planet below and the faint shimmer of atmospheric distortion at its edge. I set the autopilot for the transit corridor. I set the comms to broadcast on the distress frequency, adding our departure data to the original beacon signal so that whoever received it would have our trajectory and survival confirmation alongside the emergency flag. Standard procedure. I did all of this with hands that I did not look at again after the override panel, because the information they would give me was not information I could act on in the current operational window, and the current operational window required my full attention. Carver came to the flight deck 20 minutes after we cleared the atmosphere. She stood in the hatch and looked at the planet on the rear display, a dark disk against the star field, orbiting its dim sun with the same equanimity it had orbited it for 4.5 billion years. The beacon got out, she said. Yes. Someone will come. I looked at the planet on the display. The surface was dark and uniform and entirely still, the same dark basalt plain we had landed on. No visible evidence of the formations or the rings or anything that had happened in the last 4 hours. Nothing about the surface that would register as anything other than the dead world it had been cataloged as for 30 years. Nothing that would give a recovery team reason to hesitate on approach, to reconsider the landing zone, to think of the 6 Hz hum in the landing struts as anything other than geological background noise. Someone will come, I said. I looked at my hands. The planet held its orbit, patient and ancient and awake, waiting in the dark between stars for the next sound to enter its crystal ear and tell it that it was not alone.